Would you ask Dr. Smith to come back in, please?
Yes.
All right, Dr. Smith.
Yes, thank you.
Ready to continue?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Smith, I'd just like to revisit with you, if I may, page 109 of this morning's transcript and what you said at lines 4 to 13. Can we just have that back up on the screen, please, for the witness? This is page 109 in the raw transcript. And so it'll appear eventually somewhere else in the final version. And on page 109, we can just have that up. Yes. At line 4, I've asked you the question. Did you ask your colleagues, what is it that tells me that 600 degrees is the limit for adequacy as opposed to 500 degrees? And your answer was as follows. OK, so when you look at the body of evidence, and I don't recall the precise discussion, but they looked at lots, the outputs from the tests that were carried out, and were looking to specify the criteria that would ensure that products that you didn't want to pass didn't pass, and those that should have passed did pass. First, what was the source of the understanding that you've expressed there?
So this was basically the understanding that was developed during the course of the work and the discussions that would have been had with the project team and the department.
So project team, Sarah Colwell and Brian Martin.
And others that were part of the experimental team, yes.
And the department, Anthony Bird.
And Tony Edwards.
And Tony Edwards.
And potentially, others that may have been there. I can't remember when people like Anthony Ferguson would have been there.
Right. But are you saying yes to the names I've given you? Sarah Colwell, yes. Brian Martin, yes. Anthony Bird, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but maybe some others as well. That's
Yes.
what I'm saying.
Was there a list of products that you didn't want to pass, as you put it, and a list of those that should have passed? Or at least a form of identification of those products?
Sorry. The benchmark in terms of the test development would be if you had a system potentially that was completely non-combustible or of limited combustibility, then you would expect those systems to pass the test. You wouldn't want to develop a test and set the criteria so that a system that was completely non-combustible or limited combustibility failed the test.
When you say products that you didn't want to pass didn't pass, can you give us some examples, perhaps, of products that you didn't want to pass and those that you did want to pass?
Well, I wouldn't have had a view on that. Maybe that's clumsily expressed.
Well, what do you mean?
I personally didn't have a preference for any products passing or any products failing, but based on the tests that were carried out, you have to basically develop the criteria on the assumption that some products will pass and some products will fail. You don't set the parameters so that everything passes and everything fails.
No, I'm just trying to understand. So the parameters of 600 were set at a point, was it? Is this right? In the relative likelihood of particular products to pass or fail?
Well, as I said, I think prior to us breaking, the 600 degrees Celsius temperature and the other criteria were basically initially conceived in the earlier fire note. So all of that discussion would have been had and would have occurred with predecessors.
Yes, that's not an answer to my question.
Yeah, but that's the point. I said this morning, I do not know the entire background and basis for these.
When you said this morning that you were looking to specify criteria that would ensure that products you didn't want to pass didn't pass and those that should have passed did pass, who set those? Who set that criteria? Who made that decision?
Well, it would have been made in the precursor to, I can't remember if it was Fire Note 9 or Fire Note 3. I think it was Fire Note 9 when the criteria were first published.
And did you ask yourself, when you were examining BR135 and the criteria, well, what would happen with a new product?
A new system.
Well, a new system or product. You use the word product in your answer. Mm-hmm. A new product comes along. How would you know whether you did want it to pass, or whether it shouldn't pass?
Well, you wouldn't with a new product, because the criteria would already be set.
Right. So does this overall tell us that the criteria of 600 degrees was set by reference to a predetermined decision about which product or classes of products you didn't want to pass and those which should?
Well, there has to be an element of that based around the perceived risk and the safety criteria.
Can you give us an example of a product that you didn't want to pass?
No, because I wasn't speaking in the context of me personally. This is in a generic sense.
Let's then go back to BR135 and mechanical performance, and I want to ask you about some consultation responses. Can we go please to BRE 30/42039? This is a consultation response from Eurosol, which is Mineral Wool, the UK Mineral Wool Association, dated the 23rd of August 2002, addressed to Sarah Colwell, from Jerry Miller, their General Secretary, and addressed also to Larry Cody, as you can see. Now, Larry Cody was a name familiar to you, wasn't he? Because he'd been on the Joint Committee of the BSI considering 8414, wasn't he?
Yes, I know.
If we go to page 2, we can see that this is the response to the consultation, as the letter on page 1 says. And if you look on page 2, you can see under page 17, assessment of performance. It says, under mechanical failure, whereas we must be content that failure criteria for fire spread has been transposed from the Fire Note 9 test to the BR135 document without change, it is disappointing that the opportunity to apply a failure criteria for mechanical failure has been missed. It is appreciated that the test primarily examines the spread of fire upwards via the cladding system. However, there remains a danger from falling debris to those escaping from the building or attempting to fight the fire from below. Now, the handwriting, I think, is this yours?
Yes,
right?
I think it is,
Yeah,
yes.
and the handwriting on the right simply says noted.
Yes.
If we go then to BRE 30/42038, we can see the response to the BR135 consultation. And this one comes from Ian Target, copy to Bill Parler at the BSI. And in fact, they're on the Fire Safety Development Group, weren't they?
Yes, it appears so, yes.
You can see that as
Yes.
far as Ian Target is concerned. And you've written, or somebody's written, who are they?
Yeah, that's not my writing.
That's not you. Do you know whose that is?
No, I don't.
Might it be Brian Martin's? Do you know?
I don't know.
You don't. What do you know about Ian Target and Bill Parler, or the Fire Safety Development Group?
I don't know Ian Target. I didn't know Ian Target. I do know, or did know, Bill Parler.
Right.
From the context of when he worked for Rockwell.
I see. Now, if we go to page 2 in this document, this is their response. And if you look, please, at item 11, paragraph 11, they also make a comment about mechanical performance, page 17, and they say this: we do not accept that no failure criteria have been set for mechanical performance. That would suggest partial collapse could only be determined by close, in italics, scrutiny of the test report, whereas it should be recorded up front as a potential hazard to firefighters, etc., as in bullet 1, page 2. We would suggest some form of impact kinetic energy limit would be appropriate. And since the velocity equals gravity, it is only the maximum mass of the falling debris which is important, either as a single piece or as a progressive collapse in several pieces. Now, next to these comments, there's a handwritten note which reads, discuss with ODPM.
Yes.
Is that your handwriting?
It looks like it, yes.
Right. Do you know why it was considered that Mr. Target and Mr. Parler's comment regarding mechanical failure criteria needed to be discussed with ODPM?
I can't recall at the time, but sat here now, I would suspect it was on the basis that there were two comments that related to the quantification of mechanical performance and that we needed to raise that with ODPM.
I see. So there was now a weight of response which now needed to be taken to government.
Well, two responses, yes.
Yeah, well, two
But,
being enough, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know whether those responses were taken to government and discussed with them?
I'm sure they would have been, yes.
Well, yes, but do you remember?
I don't recall
Right,
the dates or anything like that, no.
Do you remember whether those discussions that would have taken place, as you recall it, provoked any response from government or any input into the final version of BR 135?
No, I don't. And I mean, it's very likely that this discussion would have taken place with the project team, so they would have had the discussion. It wouldn't have been me personally that would have had the discussion.
At all events, I think it's apparent from the final version of the document we've looked at that whatever discussions were had with government, mechanical performance was not accepted as or not inserted as a criteria.
No, and as I said before lunch, I think part of the issue there is, whilst on paper it's a very simple thing to describe, it's a very, very difficult thing to actually measure. And it's, in a meaningful and consistent way.
But that leads to a question. Do you know from your own knowledge whether it was the BRE who advised the government not to accede to this invitation and have a mechanical performance criterion in BR 135, or whether BRE recommended it, but it was either ignored or rejected by government?
No, I don't know.
Let's then turn to the industry understanding of BS 8414 and BR 135. In your statement, let's go to it, at page 10, please, paragraph 34. This is BRE 405624. You say this at paragraph 34. You say, an important point to note is that both BS 8414 and BR 135 relate to testing complete cladding systems. They do not relate to testing individual components or materials and cannot be used for that purpose. Now, that is an important point to note, as you say. Do you think that that important point was sufficiently understood by industry on publication of BR 135 in 2003?
I think they understood it in terms of the testing that they had to carry out. They had to construct a system. They didn't just come and construct an element of a system.
Do you think it was understood by industry? Well, I'm sorry, there's a prior point I should ask you. In those two sentences, are you not addressing the point that the results from a BS 8414 test, which passed the BR 135 criteria, could only be used in a real-life system that exactly corresponded to the full-scale system as tested?
Predominantly, yes.
Yes. Now, do you think that was sufficiently understood by industry from the time of the publication of the second edition?
Our view was that it was.
And what was that view based on?
Discussions with the industry.
Did you never hear at any time after 2003 of any confusion or misunderstanding about that?
No, not in those terms.
Did the BRE take any particular steps to ensure that industry had a clear understanding that BS 8414 was not only a system test, but a test that couldn't tell you anything about individual components or products, but only the performance of the system?
Well, insofar as the test sponsors were concerned, I think it was as clear as we could make it that the results of the test and the classification report, assuming that they met the criteria, were only applicable. There was a physical statement in all of those reports that those results and that classification only applied to the system that had been tested.
There's nothing in the publication, though, is there, in 2003 to that effect?
I don't know.
Take it from me, there isn't.
Right.
Because it leads to a later question. Do you know about the department? Having made reference to Fire Note 9 and then BS 8414 within the text of approved document B, as we saw, Fire Note 9 in the 2000 edition and then later in 2006, 8414, did the department take any steps itself, to your knowledge, to educate the market on how the test could be used?
I don't know.
Right. Did the BRE do anything to monitor the use of this new route to compliance in order to understand itself that it was in turn understood by industry?
Not at the design end. We had no route into the design end of the construction sector per se. I mean, obviously people like Sarah Colwell and others would give presentations around all of this on, quite a regular basis in an attempt and, to make sure people did understand.
Yes, and indeed I was going to ask you that very question. Phil Clark told us, day 95, page 44, lines 13 to 23, that there were presentations given by Sarah Colwell and Stephen Howard, and indeed by you, Dr. Smith, in which it was made clear that this was a system test and could only be applied to, in the real world, to a cladding structure which exactly corresponded to the system tested. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't routinely give presentations on this subject, no.
Right, but what about Stephen Howard and Sarah Colwell? They did they?
They did, yes.
Did you ever see those presentations or slideshows which they sent?
Well, they would have presented them. They wouldn't just send a document. They would go and physically attend a conference, seminar, workshop or whatever and present it.
Did you ever see any of their slides?
Yes.
Can you remember particularly slides that they put out to market participants spelling out the fact that the results of a BS 8414 test on a particular system could only be used in real life in a replicate of that system?
I don't recall the content of their presentations, but at the time, what they were presenting was correct as far as I was concerned, yes.
Right.
I mean, obviously, you don't put everything on the slides either. You speak to the slides and then you have a discussion and you take questions. So there would be opportunity for anybody that misunderstood or wasn't sure to ask and then to have the points clarified.
Now, let's go then to the third edition of BR 135 in 2013. That's at CEL 403364. And you can see that the authors are Sarah Colwell and Tony Baker this time. Now, can we then go, please, to page 27, which is Appendix A, or part of Appendix A, which is the detailed criteria for BS 8414 Part 1, the masonry test, which starts 2 pages before on page 25. Here on page 27, you can see in the left-hand column, under the 3 bullet points, some text which says, the classification applies only to the system as tested and detailed in the classification report. The classification report can only cover the details of the system as tested. It cannot state what is not covered. When specifying or checking a system, it is important to check that the classification documents cover the end-use application. And if we go to page 31, we can see exactly the same words used in Appendix B for cladding systems over structural steel frames. You see that, I think, under the bullet points in the right-hand column, second paragraph down. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, did you understand that that principle there, as articulated in that text, was always to apply to a BS 8414 test, whether under Part 1 or Part 2, as it was developed from 2005, from the very outset?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go then back to the second edition in 2003, let's have this up at the same time. But we can keep page 31 of the third edition, which is, of course, Annex B. But if we go back then to the second edition at BRE 405554, and go to page 22, have that up at the same time, we can compare and contrast. Of course, there is no Annex B, is there, in the 2003 edition, because the
No.
structural steel frame test part 2 hadn't come in yet.
That's right. That
Yeah.
was published in
So,
2005.
but we are, I think, comparing like with like. And if you cast your eye to the right-hand part of the screen, page 22, this is the 2003 second edition, you can see the 3 bullet points there under the performance criteria and classification method, and there's nothing there as there is in
Yes.
the 2013. Now, do you know, first, why the text which appeared in the 2013 edition on the left-hand side of your screen under the bullet points wasn't in the 2003 edition on the right-hand side of your screen under the 3 bullet points?
No, I don't.
Was there any discussion, do you remember, at the time of the publication of the 2003 edition about whether such a text should be put in to make it crystal clear?
I don't know.
You don't know? I mean, you don't know whether there was discussion, but you're not party to that discussion?
Correct.
Right. Do you know what it was, then, that prompted its inclusion in the 3rd edition a decade later?
Not definitively, no.
Even undefinitively? Even vaguely, do you know?
All right, well, what I would suspect is that because this kind of text was then routine in the testing and classification reports, it was seen as prudent to include it in here too.
Had the BRE come in the decade between 2003 and 2013 to the realisation that industry had failed to understand that meeting the BR 135 criteria on one build-up tested under BS 8414 could not be used to justify the use of a different build-up?
I'm not aware of that, no. I mean, this was more about, certainly the text that's in the test and classification report is about the field of application and the direct field of application. And this is just, I think, adding consistency to what was already known and was already out there and included.
Yeah, yes, but why was it thought important to add it to the text of the criteria itself, which is, of course, a document referred to in approved document B, as opposed to the individual classification reports?
Well, I suppose you could argue, well, why not? If it's adding clarity and it's, making things, in our view, even clearer and more consistent, then why wouldn't you add it?
Well, indeed so. Why was there a need for greater clarity in 2013 than in 2003 in this respect?
I think it was just picking up the current status and the best practice as it was.
Do you remember any discussion about the addition of this text in 2013?
No, I don't.
Can I just show you what Tony Baker said in his evidence to the inquiry? Yes. This is day 100, page 122. And he says this at line 9. And he's asked about this, and he says, yes, I think that the predecessor to this document, which is the 2003 edition, so he's talking about that edition, wasn't quite as clear as it could have been, so we inserted those clauses just to clarify that situation. In fact, we actually put that wording in the classification report as well. I think what you're saying is it tallies with that. So the question I have for you is this: on what basis had it been decided that the second edition of BR 135 wasn't, as he puts it, quite clear enough and needed to be clarified?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, all I can say is, you get different people that are involved, and, that may have been a contribution that Tony actually picked up and made as to, I think we can be clearer about this within the context of field of application. Right. Different people with different views, and if that was felt that it was adding value to the document, then, of course, you would put it in.
Well, let me show you what else he says. If we go to line 15, there's a question. Was that also done because of a concern that the industry, the construction industry, wasn't fully appreciating that the classification only applied to the system as tested, answer at line 19, yeah, that had certainly, we'd become aware of that. Although I think if the industry had thought about it a bit more, they would have been aware anyway. But clearly the message wasn't getting through previously, so we felt that it was prudent to put that sort of wording in the BR 135. Do you agree with Tony Baker that, as he says, clearly the message wasn't getting through previously?
Well, I didn't have any first-hand experience of that, so I can't comment on
You can't agree or disagree, is that?
That's
I see.
correct.
Do you know who made the decision to include that wording in the 2013 edition, the third edition?
I would have expected that would have been discussed between Tony and Sarah, and they would have agreed.
Right. You don't know yourself?
No, I don't.
All right. Now, I want to ask you some questions next about the BRE's relationship with government, and I want to focus in that on how it worked in practice. We've seen a BRE Code of Conduct, and I'd like to show you that first. It's at BRE 3035257. And we can see from the top right-hand corner of page 1 that it's dated the 1st of September 2014. Mm-hmm. Was the same or similar Code of Conduct in existence before that?
There would have been a Code of Conduct, yes.
Well, was there?
Yes, there would have been.
Well, was there? I mean, it's not a would have question, it's a was there question.
Yes.
Yes. If we look at the first few pages, we can see yes, page 1, and the core value is page 2. And if you look at page 2, our ethical principles, you see halfway down. The first one in italics right, is honesty and integrity. Can you see that?
Yes.
And then at the bottom of the page, 2, excellence. Yes?
Yes.
Second bullet point. Now, those principles of excellence are described as a duty to ensure, it says, that we acquire and use wisely and faithfully the knowledge that is relevant to the skills we need in the service of others. We will, and it goes on, always act with care and competence. And then over the page, please. So, second bullet point, but on page 3 at the top, keep our knowledge and skills up to date. And then second bullet point, not knowingly mislead or allow others to be misled. You see that?
Yes.
And then third bullet point, present and review evidence, theory and interpretation honestly, accurately and without bias.
Yes.
And if we move down to page 3, further down the page, go past the section respect for life, law and the public good. You can see a section headed expertise, science and research, yes?
Yes.
And it says this: we aspire to the highest standards of leadership and management excuse me, in the exploitation of knowledge, communication and our people, and will remember that we hold a privileged and trusted position in society and thus expect to demonstrate that we are seeking to serve wider society and be sensitive to public concerns. Demonstrate that we are aware of the issues that science and technology raise for society and listen to the aspirations and concerns of others. Actively promote public awareness and understanding of the impact and benefits of our work. And be objective and truthful in any statement made in our professional capacity.
Yes.
Now, what is the privileged and trusted position in society to which this section refers?
I didn't write this. I would imagine it was the position that BRE was seen to hold within the sector.
Why did it have such a position historically? Do you know?
I think it was around the fact that BRE was independent and was able to act independently of external influences and any particular one sectoral interest. And in that way, even after privatisation, the industry were able to come to BRE and felt able to come to BRE because whether you made, say timber frame or concrete frame or steel frame, for example, it didn't matter. The work was still carried out in the same manner, but there was no motivation to promote one type of approach over another. So it was a very sort of independent and position, basically.
Independence is one thing, but this says privileged and trusted position in society,
Yeah,
which sounds like the BRE was occupying a unique or at least rare position with regard to the public interest in this country. Can you explain what that was?
I don't understand what it means by privileged position, not in 2014. As I say, trusted in the sense of that I've already discussed, I've already just explained. I mean, I wouldn't regard us to be privileged, as in as of 2014.
Really, what I'm driving at is, do you agree that both before and after 2014, the BRE held either a unique or a very rare position in the society in this country because because of the work that it did was of enormous importance in the public interest and not just in its own private interests?
Yes. And I think that was valued, and the connection to the BRE Trust was obviously central to that as well.
Would it be right that the principles I've just read out to you would apply in all circumstances across all aspects of the BRE work without regard for who the sponsors were, whether it was government or whether it was commercial sponsors?
Correct.
And how did the BRE address any potential conflicts, either commercially funded work or government funded work, between the interests of the paying client on the one hand and the duty to serve the public interest in this country on the other?
So the public interest part obviously depended on the work that was being undertaken. In terms of the commercial sort of testing type work, which obviously was all undertaken predominantly for commercial customers, there were further rules around impartiality, conflicts of interest, which were looked at, they were declared, and were managed through the local quality system. So this is a higher level quality document for the BRE group in an overarching way, but then obviously there are documents that sit below this that provide the other safeguards and the processes and the methodologies that were employed to control those things.
Was there any training provided for the BRE staff, who were particularly those who were client-facing, on that particular aspect of the BRE's work, by which I mean the policies and procedures you've just described relating to conflicts of interest?
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about that training. First of all, to what level of employee was it delivered?
It was delivered to the entire company. It wasn't restricted to, that you can't come or you can't come. It was basically delivered by the quality and compliance team at various points in time and through different routes. One in particular being every Friday morning in the testing and certification part of the business. There was about a 45-minute to an hour's meeting every Friday morning without fail, and part of that meeting would, on occasions, not every week of course, but be taken up with focused training sessions around these types of things.
And did those focused training sessions, first, when did they begin? When did these Friday mornings
probably
begin?
Early as around 2006.
Right. And when they started, how regularly were questions about bias and conflict of interest examined?
I don't know without going back and doing an audit trail, but the compliance and quality manager would deliver these training sessions, and people were expected to either be in attendance, or if they weren't in attendance, then typically a member of their team would be in attendance, and then that would be cascaded.
Right. Were there any case studies presented, practical problems, and what to do if?
Yes, I think there probably were. I mean, obviously different quality and compliance managers or directors had different approaches to this and would use their own material. So it would be different examples. And from my experience, those sort of sessions continued and were continuing right up to the point at which I retired.
During the period between 2006 and your retirement, was there any system by which the Q&C team and their supervision of the delivery of this training was peer reviewed or independently reviewed and examined from outside the organisation?
Well, I guess UCAS would have wanted to see some evidence of that, but I can't be more definitive than that.
Have you ever had any concerns at any stage of your career with the BRE about government influence on any aspect of the particular research or work that you were carrying out?
What, in terms of influencing the results?
Well, any government influence over what you should do, the direction in which you should be conducting your research, the kinds of topics you should be researching, how you should carry out the tests, and how you presented the results. You tell me.
So, I mean, in terms of the research that was actually carried out as after privatisation, we were not influential in terms of defining that research. So that would be, as I said, I think in one of the earlier sessions, latterly tendered through government procurement portals, and you basically respond to the project as tendered. So now whether that covered the things that we thought ought to be covered or would have liked to have covered or as extensively as covered, of course that's always open to debate and comment. But the fact of the matter was that was it, and you either bid for it or you didn't.
Did you ever have any concerns more broadly about any issues or problems in terms of the government, in terms of BRE's ability to ensure that both the interests of its government as a client, its government client, and those of wider society were being served?
I mean, we would always, there were always a long list of areas that we felt needed research, and we weren't necessarily, we didn't keep that confidential. From time to time, those would be discussed, but at the same time, we had no control over what was funded and what the priorities were set in the department. So, that was very much their role and their responsibility, and we had to accept that.
Do you remember whether there were any times, any periods during which there were difficulties in the relationship between the BRE and central government?
Yes, I think there probably were some times when the relationship was more difficult than others. I can think of several occasions where we tendered for the frameworks in particular. I think of the second and the third framework. And, you bid into that, you declare day rates and so on. And financial pressures meant that, they then approached BRE and potentially other framework contractors and said, we need you to shave 10, 20% off your day rates. And, that's unrealistic.
Yes, I think Dr. Crowder gave us some insights into that too.
Yeah.
Let me show you a document which you may be able to help us with. BRE 30s14770 on this theme. And this is a PowerPoint presentation with the BRE stamp. To be delivered, I think, by Julie Brigula and you, Dr. Smith, yes?
Yes.
And just to be clear, Julie Brigula, I think you've told us a bit about her. She was the Director of Fire Sciences, wasn't she, when you became Managing Director in 2016, yes?
Yes, and prior to that she was the Director in the Building Technology Group.
Yeah.
which dealt with all the structural the structural performance.
Now
Part
looking at
A.
this Looking at this document, we don't know the date of it, but can you help when this was
Can I
delivered?
see the content of it? That might
Yes,
help me.
let's go down to page 2. We can see a slide about the building regulations, and that might help. If we have that expanded a bit further, please. Can we have it expanded any further than that? Yes, that might help. UK building regulations, and there on the right-hand side you've got approved document A, which looks like the 2004 edition incorporating amendments. That's about structure.
Right, yes.
And it's does that help with the dating of the document?
Yeah,
Right.
so I mean, it would have been around that sort of time, I guess.
Right.
And I say this is the area that Julie predominantly worked in.
It says BRE worked on most parts in the past, mostly when part of government. For some parts of BRE, difficult relationship with departments since privatisation. What parts of the BRE had a difficult relationship with the department in that period?
So I think this is referring to, there were certain areas that basically government stopped funding research into. Not Part A and Part B, but in some of the other parts.
And if we go down to page 4, we can see a list of the reasons why the partnership between the BRE and government had been successful, I think. You can see that, yes?
Yes.
And the fourth bullet point, or bullet dash, I suppose, is it says develops ideas and delivers subjective experimental research to support your policy objectives. Now, just encapsulating that idea, develops ideas and delivers objective experimental research to support your policy objectives. Was that right? Was that your view, that part of the role of BRE's research work, when sponsored by government, was to support its policy objectives?
Well, insofar as they only did experimental research where they had, a potential issue around their policy. So,
And thinking specifically about fire safety research, what would happen in circumstances where the research or the evidential data wasn't aligned with particular government objectives, policy objectives, or didn't support a particular government policy?
it probably wouldn't have got funded.
It wouldn't have got funded.
So the research wouldn't have happened.
Where it says develops ideas and delivers objective experimental research to support your policy objectives, how is supporting the government's policy objectives consistent with the aspiration of robust independence that we see from the Ethics Code, admittedly in 2014? Did things change?
No, they didn't. And I think this is written within the context that we would carry out the objective research, because even in the first framework after privatisation, the work was very much carried out under contract, and the contracts were very clear about the scope of the work that needed to be undertaken. So the expectation was that the work would not be being undertaken if it wasn't in some way being considered within overall government policy. But that's not a reason for not doing the research and delivering, a technical outcomes to the questions that have been asked and posed.
No, but it might be a reason, mightn't it, for not being as ruthless, robust and independent in your interpretation of your data when presenting it to government, that you might worry that it didn't support their policy objectives.
No, that was never my experience anyway.
Let's go to page 6, please. If we can have that expanded. BRE strengths. First bullet, understands and respects the political dimension of the work. What does that mean?
My reading of that now is that understanding that some of these areas would be sensitive and would need to be handled by the department appropriately. So that's where you come into the introduction and use of industry stakeholder groups, the need to report the work appropriately, but it would only be released fully into the public domain once it had been properly reviewed. It's all of those sorts of aspects that come in and form part of understanding the space within which the department is operating. It's not about crafting their policy for them.
Well, the answer you've just given tends to suggest that your understanding, or your reading now, as you say, of that was matters of process. But first I'm interested in what you meant by it at the time, given that you were one of the authors of this slide. Yes?
Yes.
But more importantly, when you use the words respects the political dimension of the work, that's not about the process, is it? That's about understanding that your work will be used for political or policy ends, isn't it?
Well, my understanding is that the work that we undertook, it wasn't ever about, and we never got involved in actually directing or setting a policy on behalf of government. That was never BRE's role, and to my knowledge, we've never done that. It's always been about knowing the space within which government operates and the department operates, and the way that they have to do that. So, I mean, it's naturally involves procedural elements within that. It's perhaps, not very well written, but that's really what it is. I mean, BRE's never been a policy maker in any way.
No, but it did contribute, didn't it, to the drafting of approved document B. Indeed, you told us this morning that you had had a direct hand in that.
Well, only insofar as, so like Brian, when he has drafted some text when he was at BRE, then that is as a draft document for broader discussion and consultation with others. So it's never, BRE are not the provider of the material in isolation for the government, and they never have been, to my knowledge. There's always been the process of discussion within committees, stakeholder groups, whatever, and then ultimately for changes to the approved documents, it goes through BRAC, and it always goes out to public consultation, always.
Can we go to page 7 of this document, please? BRE only organisation successfully qualifying for a range of disciplines, and if you look if you can turn the page, perhaps. I think I've got the wrong page there. If you turn the page, please. No, that's not it. Never mind. Did you understand at the time that manufacturers were seeking to exploit ambiguities in approved document B?
I was not personally aware of that, no.
You were not personally aware. Was it never brought to your attention that manufacturers might be riding on the back or exploiting loopholes or elements of lack of clarity in approved document B for their own gain?
Not back at that time now. Of course, with hindsight, what we all know now, my view would be different.
Can we go to page 6 of the document, which is what I was trying to find? It's underneath understands and respects political dimension. It's the next thing down. Conscious of commercial agendas and tactics of manufacturers, test houses, consultants. What did you understand at the time about the tactics of manufacturers?
That's probably referring to the earlier discussion that we had, I think it's earlier yesterday, where we were aware of the aggressive marketing, etc., that was going on in the insulation industry in particular.
Yes, and we saw the factions, I think, referred to. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, yes.
So what, one faction dissembling about the fire safety of the others?
Yes.
Anything else? Any tactics of manufacturers to state over-generously, perhaps, the test results of a particular product so as to get it out into the market? Are you aware of that at this time?
No, I don't think I was.
Right.
No.
You became aware of that, presumably, at some point?
Well, obviously I'm aware of it now.
No, but before the Grenfell
Yeah,
Tower
I
fire.
can't remember at what point that would have been.
Right. I'd like to turn then to a new topic, which is the investigation of real fires project, from which we've heard some evidence from previous witnesses, particularly Dr. Crowder. It's right to think that that project started in 1988, didn't it?
I believe so.
Can we go to BRE 401054? This is the investigation of real fires report prepared by the BRE for the period April 2003. I'm afraid it's absolutely minuscule. Can we please expand it? April 2003 to March 2004. And the date of the document, as you can see on the page there, is the 2nd of April 2004. And this version was prepared by, among others, Brian Martin, yes? Who was still at the BRE at that stage.
Okay, I don't know, I can't see.
Well, if we go to page 2, I think we can see that. And it was prepared for Anthony Bird. Can you see that? Anthony,
Yes, I can now, yes.
Yes. And it was approved by Peter Field. And if we go to page 3, we can see that one of the objectives of the project, under the executive summary, in the second paragraph there, was to inform approved document B. And let's read it together. It says, the information gathered is primarily used to inform approved document B for England and Wales, with occasional input to the regulatory documents in Scotland and Northern Ireland. This information must offer effective solutions to real fire problems, which can only be done by examining information from real fires. Positive feedback is provided where guidance has helped to minimise fire spread and threat to life. Now, did you yourself see this document when it was first produced and sent to government?
No.
Nevertheless, did you understand that paragraph there to encapsulate the principal purpose of the Real Fires project?
No.
No?
No, I wouldn't. I wasn't involved in the fire investigation project at that time.
Did you have any understanding about its purpose?
Only very vaguely.
What was the extent of your involvement in the Real Fires project?
At that time, none.
At that time, none. Did there come to be involvement in the Real Fires project during its life?
Not actually an involvement in it, but the fire investigation team moved into an area that I was managing probably around 2007, 2006, 2007.
I follow. Well, let's see how we go with this then, because maybe you can help us rather more. Can we go, please, to Tom Lennon's witness statement? This is at BRE 30436688, page 9, paragraph 48. He says, well, I'll show you the question and then his answer. The question at... can we scroll up, please, to a little bit higher up the screen? Yes. Question D. In the period during which you had any involvement with these reports, who was ultimately responsible for the content of reports produced under the Investigation of Real Fires project contract? And then he says, Debbie Smith had ultimate responsibility for the content of the reports, but day-to-day responsibility would have been either with Martin Shipp or latterly Dave Crowder. Is he right that you had ultimate responsibility for the content of the Investigation of Real Fires reports?
Well, only insofar as I was the manager of the area, but that responsibility was delegated to others. So, very many of the fire investigation reports I didn't see, I didn't review.
Right.
They were reviewed by others who had the delegated responsibility to do that.
As manager of the area, did you not read these reports?
Not all of them, no. No,
But some
I
of
didn't.
them?
I mean, you just, when you have a responsibility for 120 people, which I would have done at that time, you cannot read every report that those individuals are preparing.
Can we please look at what
Not possible.
Chara Holland says about this? This is BRE 30438829, page 10, please, paragraph 33, she says, on the basis of the above, Debbie Smith had overall responsibility for the contract and therefore the content of the reports. The majority of the reports produced were approved by Corinne Williams, acting on behalf of Debbie Smith. However, each report also underwent separate technical checks or peer review prior to being sent to Dr. Williams and or Dr. Smith for approval. Is what she says there, so far as it involves you, correct?
Yes, around what I've just said. I mean, overall, I was responsible for the contract, as I was for a number of contracts. However, in order to manage and to deliver, etc., effectively, those responsibilities get delegated to people that are acting on your behalf and that you trust professionally and have demonstrated their competence to do so.
Now, Tom Lennon says in his statement, we don't need to get back to it, but it's at paragraph 47 on page 9, that he, and I'm quoting, did not undertake any specific training or qualifications, unquote, in relation to the fire investigations project. Is that right?
I don't know.
Corinne Williams says the same thing, in effect, at paragraph 34 of her statement. She says she never received any specific training or qualifications because she's not a specialist fire investigator and does not usually attend fire scenes. So, again, is that right?
If that's what Corinne said, then yes, I must assume that is correct.
Can you explain why BRE staff who had no training, if they're right about that, or qualifications, if they're right about that, in relation to fire investigations, were allocated to carry out work on this project for the government?
Well, I personally had no fire investigation qualification either. And in order to review and authorise reports, as I think we've discussed previously, you can't be an expert in everything, and that is where you rely on the people that are experts to peer review the work of their team, of the people that that have undertaken the work.
And who was peer reviewing the work of this team?
Obviously, they don't mark their own homework. So if David Crowder had undertaken some work, then Martin Shipp would have reviewed it, and then vice versa. But you know, you just cannot be an expert in absolutely everything.
No, but given that they were deputed to do this government project, why didn't they have any training on the subject on which they were working?
Well, they would have at least had briefings and discussed the work if they were going to do a site investigation, in the case of Tom Lennon, with Martin Shipp and or David Crowder. They wouldn't be deployed, I would suggest, to just go and do whatever they felt like doing. They would be given guidelines and as to what they needed to do when they were there, what we were looking to get out of an investigation. And they wouldn't, I don't think, anyway, have gone in isolation without somebody such as Martin Shipp or David Crowder with them, the first few times that they went out. A lot of the work that was done in the fire investigation area in that sense, so in the case of Tom Lennon, he would have been brought into the fire investigation team for his specific professional and technical expertise. So the fire investigation team would have felt they needed his input on a particular structural aspect of the fire, and that's why he would have been called in if they knew that there was a particular structural issue associated with that fire that they were investigating. So it's about making sure that you have the right technical makeup of the team, and then the work is guided and peer reviewed. And I mean, I don't believe for 1 minute, as I said, that somebody like Tom Lennon would have just been phoned up and told, can you go and investigate this fire, without any briefing, knowledge, background, or without anybody having been there with him in the first few instances.
Can we then look, please, at the BRE's investigation of real fires framework from 2012, which is at BRE 50951. And this is dated the 1st of October 2012, as you can see, prepared by Martin Shipp. If you go please to page 2, you'll see that. It was prepared for Brian Martin, who's now in government, and had been, I think, for 4 years, by Martin Shipp and approved by you. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And if we go to page 4, we can see from the second paragraph that the proposal was submitted for a contract to run for 3 years between November 2012 and March 2015. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And this proposal was, I think, accepted, to cut a long story short, and the contract was let to the BRE, wasn't it?
Yes, this was not under a framework. This was outside of the framework, so a proper. It was tendered through one of the government portals. Yeah. Right.
And sticking with page 4, if we can, you can see the overarching objectives of the project, and then there's a long list of bullet points. And if you look at the third bullet point, it includes or is. Provide DCLG with an unbiased, robust and independent evidence/information to enable the DCLG to take a proactive approach in ensuring that policies and guidance remain proportionate to the risk and continue to be fit for purpose, but also to support the continued review of general policies in order to identify and or remove simplify existing regulations that have the potential to unnecessarily impede growth. You see that?
Yes.
And then underneath that, 2 down, to monitor the effectiveness of Part B of the building regulations and the guidance in ADB in achieving fire safety in real buildings in England and in providing protection for firefighters. Similarly, monitor the impact of British, European and international standards on building products and systems which have a consequence on real incidents in England. And then I think bullet point 10, down at the bottom, it's penultimate bullet, to identify and indicate areas for research or for potential changes to Part B ADB arising from specific problems highlighted in fire investigations. Now, just keeping those 3 bullets I've read to you in mind, can we then go, please, to page 51? Page 51, middle of the page, all reports will, if we can just have that expanded. And if you see that, it says all reports will, yes, you see that?
Yes.
And then it goes, third bullet point, not contain any policy recommendations. All reports produced by BRE for this project will not contain any proposed text for a revision to an approved document or supporting guidance. With the agreement of or at the request of DCLG, such material will only be provided in a separate policy implications report as and when necessary and following the format of a Type 3 report, as this will typically need to be published separately. Now, that was a contractual requirement, wasn't it?
Yes.
You were bound by contract that your reports must not contain any policy recommendations or proposals for revisions to approved document B, yes?
Yes.
Yes. How do you reconcile that requirement with the objectives we've just looked at, and in particular the stated aim of identifying and indicating areas for research or potential changes to Part B or ADB?
So this is talking about the reports produced by BRE. I mean, alongside all of this, there were day-to-day interactions between the project teams and the department. I mean, it was necessary because to attend an on-site investigation, there would have to be a discussion and an agreement with the department that was a fire worthy of visiting and to be included. So it didn't preclude those sorts of issues being flagged up, but clearly what they were asking is that you don't put that in the reports per se.
Oh, I see. So did it work like this? That you were expected to, in fact you were bound to assist government in identifying and indicating areas for research or potential changes to Part B and approved document B, but you couldn't do that in a report. You had to do it informally or through discussion. Is that how it worked?
Well, I'm not entirely sure because, I mean, having said that, then of course there were some small research projects that were carried out. So clearly there was a discussion around those that led to the research that was conducted on the back of those, and reports of that research as such were written. So, but I suppose in terms of the actual policy recommendations, then they asked those were not recorded within these reports.
Well, we've seen that you approved this contract.
Yes.
So you essentially had the ultimate signing power, didn't you? And that's, you were the one who signed this off at the BRE, as we understand it.
The proposal, yes.
Yeah.
This is what this was, a proposal.
And can we take it from that you read it and read it carefully before you signed it?
Yes.
Yeah. So when you did that, did you not ask yourself how the BRE could hope to achieve the policy objective identified earlier on in the document, identifying areas for research or potential changes to Part B or ADB, whilst at the same time being bound not to make any policy recommendations in its reports? How is that going to work?
Well, I say.
How did you think it was going to work at the time?
I mean, I would have discussed this with Martin Shipp, and he would have, basically convinced me of the way that this was going to operate. But as I say, there were regular dialogue ongoing between the project team and the department around this contract once it had been let. I mean, there had to be.
So coming back to my question, is this how you understood it to work, that your reports couldn't contain any policy recommendations, it was forbidden by contract, but you would have discussions, meetings outside the reports, which you would use to indicate areas for research or potential change to the regulations or the approved document?
Yes, and I mean that clearly happened because there were these small research projects that occurred, during the course of the project.
What do you think the point of that was? Why not? Why bind yourself not to put anything into your reports that have been the subject of discussions and these small projects?
But this wasn't up for debate. This wasn't a tender that you could debate with the department. It was something that was done through the procurement portal and was handled by procurement officials at government level, and it was competitive. So
maybe, but my question isn't that. My question is, what did you think the point was? What was the government trying to achieve? You must have had a view about that.
I don't know what the government were trying to achieve.
Would it be right that any policy implications reports would only be provided or written at the request of the department?
That's what they were instructing, yes.
And those reports, I think, were subject to review, amendment and ultimate approval by the department as well, weren't they?
Yes.
Now, in this section of the proposal, we can see here that it refers to policy implications reports needing to be published separately. That's the fourth line of the third bullet point there, as you can see, yes? Were policy implications reports ever released into the public domain so far as you were aware?
I don't recall. They may have been when reviews of the approved document were coming up.
Right. As far as you were aware, did the BRE...
recall.
Oh, sorry, you started to answer again. You don't recall?
No.
As far as you were aware, did the BRE ever write or submit to the department any policy implications reports on the subject of external fire spread?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did the BRE ever ask or offer to prepare a policy implications report on any aspect of the building regulations or guidance on external fire spread?
Not that I'm aware of.
Were those reports that were written intended to be published, or were they confidential to the department and only to be published with the consent of the department?
Well, all reports were only published with consent of the department.
Were any such reports published? Do you know?
In the context of the annual reports, or?
Well, the fire investigation reports.
I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, we're mid-topic, although not very mid. But
Again.
yeah. Yes, it keeps happening, I'm afraid. But we are going to turn to a different document at least.
Well, should we take a
At
break
least
at
we're
that
not
point?
mid-document. Yes, let's
Yes,
do that.
I think we'll have the break now before we get stuck into some other document. So we'll stop now. We'll come back, please, at 3:30.
Okay.
And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 3:30, please. Would you ask Dr. Smith to come back in, please? Right, ready to carry on, Dr. Smith?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Can I ask you, turning back to the Real Fires project, please, to go to Martin Ship's witness statement at BRE 3047594, please. This is his second statement to the inquiry, page 27, paragraph 134. And I just want to ask you about the second part of that paragraph. I want page 27, paragraph. Right. It doesn't look right to me. No, this is the wrong witness statement. What we want, I can see why, we want BRE 3047594, please.
Sorry, my laptop just froze.
Right.
You need a few seconds, please.
Right.
Yes, thank you very much. Page 27, paragraph 134. And the first part of that paragraph relates to publications of the Real Fires reports. But then he goes on to say, 3 lines up from the bottom, secondly, the findings from any particular investigation would always be a one-off, and it's important to be reasonably assured that the findings are generally applicable, or if not, then sufficiently significant in themselves. Do you agree with that, Dr. Smith?
I mean, I guess what Martin is referring to here is that if a particular fire was an outlier in some way, then you would not make wholesale changes based on a particular outlier.
So you do agree with him?
Well, if that's the context that he means there, then I would be inclined to agree with that, yes.
Yeah. On what basis would the BRE be able to conclude that the findings would always be a one-off?
No, I don't know why he would say that would always be a one-off. I mean, obviously, they might build up a pattern over a number of fire investigations, so they wouldn't always necessarily be a one-off.
The context for this is the reasons for not publishing the fire investigation reports, and one of the reasons is that the findings from any particular investigation would always be a one-off. Do you agree with him? Would they always be a one-off?
Well, they would always be specific to a particular occurrence, but that doesn't mean that there might not be patterns in terms of what was seen.
Yes, and it wasn't part of the purpose of carrying out these investigations to find out whether or not the contributing factors to the various fires were one-offs, in other words, only negligibly likely to be repeated elsewhere, or whether there was some systemic issue or emerging trend.
That was my understanding,
Right.
yes.
And who would be responsible within the BRE for establishing whether or not any findings from these reports were generally applicable, as he puts it?
Martin and the fire investigation team.
So not your team, not you particularly?
No.
And who was responsible for deciding whether any particular findings were sufficiently significant in themselves?
Well, I would expect them to report them as they found them, so they would, if they started to see trends, they would report those trends, and then ultimately it would be for the department to decide if it was sufficiently significant.
So it was the department. Can we go to page 135, paragraph 135 on page 28, where Mr. Shipp goes on to tell us this. He says, it is perhaps also worth pointing out that findings from fire investigations by themselves very seldom lead to proposed changes to government guidance. I think he means led, but specifically ADB. Even rarer would they lead directly to proposed changes to the building regulations. BRE's findings from fire investigations are nearly always just the start of a more formal process leading to changes in the building regulations or ADB or British standards or other codes, which involves a carefully formulated research project under stakeholder guidance and wide consultation. Do you agree with that?
I've not really thought about it within that context before, but that probably is true, because generally if you spot a trend, it's more than likely that you would want to then carry out some further research to further understand what the trend was and then how that might be better quantified or whatever the
Right.
issue was.
What was the point of it all if it wasn't going to lead to some changes, at least to the approved document, if not the building regulation?
Well, what he's saying here, it didn't directly lead to those,
Well, it
but it
doesn't.
might have been a step on the way to leading to changes. So I think one example that Martin himself was involved in was car park fires, where there was a trend of car park fires, and that then led to some research to better quantify what was going on.
Finally, on this topic, I just want to ask you some questions about overall findings. Can we go to BRE 50939? And I'm using this as an example. This is the Investigation of Real Fires report for the period April 2008 to March 2009, that year. BRE 50939. Prepared for Brian Martin. If we can go to page 2, please. You can see that it's prepared by Martin Shipp and David Crowder, among others, and approved on behalf of the BRE by Dr. Williams, Corinne Williams, dated the 24th of March 2009. And if we go to page 3, and I'd like just to scroll through page 3, page 4, you can see a list, long list of fires. Mm-hmm. Page 4, lots of flats and houses. Page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8. If we could just scroll forward, please. Page 7 there. Page 8 next. Page 9. There are a huge number of fires, aren't there?
Yes.
And is it fair to say that, I'm picking this as an example, this number of fires is fairly typical of those covered in a 12-month period by reports in this project at this time?
I don't know for sure, but I would expect this to be the case.
Yeah. And if we look at page 14, you can see at the top of the screen, synopsis of findings. The findings from this period have reaffirmed the overall effectiveness of the building regulations and ADB in providing for the safety of life in the event of fire, and most of the significant issues that have been identified during the study fall outside the scope of the regulations. Now, just looking at that, are you aware that each and every final report for each of the BRE's investigations of real fires projects for the government between 2001 and 2015 had reached exactly the same conclusion using exactly the same wording?
No, I wasn't.
You weren't aware of that?
No.
Do you know who approved that wording or drafted it?
No, I don't.
Have you ever had a chance to consider, or opportunity to consider, whether that statement was true and accurate on each and every occasion that this report was given to government?
No.
Is it genuinely the case that in that 14-year period, the findings from these investigation of real fires reports covering hundreds and hundreds of fires reaffirmed the overall effectiveness of the building regulations and approved document B in providing for life safety?
I don't know.
It can't possibly be right, can it? Given the inadequacy of small-scale testing as a means of controlling the potential hazards of fire, at least in relation to external cladding systems.
Yeah, I don't know.
And that one particular inadequacy that you and I have been discussing for some days now, and you told us about during the first day of your evidence, was directly relevant, wasn't it, to the effectiveness of the guidance in approved document B? The unreliability of the BS 476 Part 6 and 7 tests, small-scale tests and intermediate tests.
Well, I guess they would have only picked that up if there had been a fire where that had been shown to be inadequate.
Did you at any time suggest that the BRE prepare a separate policy implications report on the adequacy and safety of continuing to keep class 0 in diagram 40 in approved document B?
No, not to my recollection.
Why is that?
It would not have been appropriate to do so. I mean, that was a matter of ongoing discussion with the department and an issue that they were well aware of.
And the conclusion, therefore, that the findings from this period reaffirm the overall effectiveness of the building regulations and approved document B in providing for the safety of life in the event of fire. And it was not only meaningless, I would suggest to you, but self-evidently false. Would you accept that?
I don't know without looking at this in great detail. I mean, I'm assuming that very competent individuals who were very professional about their work would have considered this within the context of the report they were writing. And it wouldn't be right for me to sit here now and make some statement without having had the opportunity to go back and revisit all and review that.
How many of these reports do you think you saw during the period 2001 to 2015?
Very few.
But of those that you did you not notice that the wording I've just read to you under synopsis of findings was identical in every single report that you saw? You didn't?
No. I say I saw so few that the pattern would not have been evident.
Well, even comparing two would identify a cut and paste from one to the other, wouldn't it?
Yes, but you don't tend to compare a report that's produced 5 years ago with one that's produced today and that's come to you for approval.
That's true, but is this a sort of document that ought to be subject to a cut and paste approach? Or a copy and move on approach?
Sorry, in the sense of...
Well, I mean, the impression that I have from the last few answers you've given is that this paragraph has just been repeated because the word processor enables you to retain it from the previous document. It suggests that the mind has not been applied to what is being said, because if it had been, it might have been expressed in a slightly different way. Or
Yes, I mean, I don't know whether it was a cut and paste into every report. I'm just basing that on what Mr. Millett has said. And I'm surprised that it is repeated in that way from 2001.
I mean, does it not come as a surprise to you to learn that a close examination by apparently qualified and trained people over hundreds, if not thousands, of fires in the United Kingdom over a period of some 14 years led to no trends at all emerging, with the result that the authors could on each and every occasion conclude that the building regulations and approved document B were overall effective in providing for the safety of life in the event of fire? Did not strike you as surprising?
Well, not at the time, because, as I say, I didn't review these reports, so I would have had no knowledge around that. I would have expected others to have considered this, and I think there were issues that emerged, certainly, for example, the car park work, which I understood came on the back of basically fire investigations of car park fires.
To your knowledge, was there any process in compiling these documents whereby you, as in the BRE and the teams doing the work, would contact the 48 or so fire and rescue services across the country and just ask them for their significant incident reports?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with the exact process that was undergone. I do know that when the contracts were originally let, there was always a communication with the fire and rescue services across the country to say that this project was ongoing, and they were looking for contacts and so on to flag up particular fires, particular issues, to sort of basically open the lines of communication. And that went to, I think, all of the chief fire officers throughout the United Kingdom.
From your knowledge, as the manager in charge of this group from 2007, was there an open line of communication between the BRE and the chief fire officers at each of the FRS areas, whereby the FRS in each case could send you their significant incident reports so that you knew what fires the FRS at least considered to be significant and which indicated emerging trends?
I mean, I can't speak from first-hand experience, but I'm sure, or I would believe that if such an incident was flagged with us from a fire and rescue service, then it would have been given due care and consideration.
Yes, but that's not my question. My question was there a system, was there a conduit whereby fire and rescue services each year would be required to send you their significant
There was no
incident?
requirement.
Why is that?
We relied on the cooperation, the voluntary cooperation of the fire and rescue services. We had no authority over them, apart from reaching out to them and, asking for their cooperation, basically. And if they chose to not engage, then there would be very little that we could do about that.
Did there never come a time in that 14-year period, 2001 to 2015, when you yourself thought of asking the fire safety department, for example, at the London Fire Brigade, the question, have you come across anything recently which would tend to question the overall effectiveness of the building regulations or approved document B in providing for life safety?
I personally did not, but there were ongoing discussions with London Fire Brigade.
But did anybody think to take all these reports, all 14 of them annually, put them together, look at the identically repeated statement that we see there under synopsis and findings, and just test it with, say, the LFB or Manchester Fire and Rescue or another area where there's significant housing density? Just ask the question.
I don't know.
Let's turn to a different topic. 2005 and the consultation for the 2006 to 7 changes to ADB. Can we start with BRE 401953, please? Now, this is a document entitled Proposal Support for the Revision of the Approved Document B and Procedural Guide, prepared for ODPM, dated 23rd of March 2004. And if we look, please, at page 2, that we can see that it was prepared by Brian Martin and signed off for the BRE by Peter Field, who at that stage was the Fire Safety Framework Service Manager. Was he on partial secondment? Was Brian Martin on partial secondment to the DCLG during this period?
I think he was.
To be clear, he says in his statement that he was embedded within the department for 2 to 3 days a week in support of its permanent technical officers, Tony Edwards and Anthony Bird. That's what he says in his statement of paragraph 6. Can you confirm that?
I have no reason to disagree with that.
Right. So he was, as it were, on both sides of the exercise, was he? He was preparing this document for the BRE, but at the same time sitting in the department for whom it was prepared.
I think there were probably different aspects to the work that was going on.
You were the Deputy Fire Safety Framework Manager at the time, weren't you?
This is 2004.
Well, this is March 2004, yes.
So I was 2004, this was the second framework. So, yes, I was basically, Peter's deputy for when he wasn't there and
Yes.
he wasn't contactable,
Yes, I mean, certainly that is Peter Field's own
Yes.
recollection at paragraph
Yes.
44 of his statement. And by the end of this project, I think you had taken over from Peter Field and you had become the Fire Safety Framework Manager.
I took over when Peter Field retired, which I think was pretty close to the end of this particular framework.
Yeah.
And the new framework, I think, began in 2008. So that's really when I took on the fire safety framework.
Can you tell us more precisely when you took over from Peter Field and became the Fire Safety Framework Manager?
It would have been when Peter retired.
Yes, can you give us a date?
I can't off the top of my head, no.
Can you give us a year?
It was probably 2007.
Right. Now, in March 2007, excuse me, you approved the closing report for this project.
Okay.
Do you remember doing that?
Not as I'm sat here now, no.
Well, let me just put a document
Yeah.
to you then. BRE 30109999. There is the closing report prepared for Anthony Bird, and if you go please to page 2, you can see your name there approving the document. Yes?
Yes.
30th of March 2007. And if we go, well, we may go into it, but we will in a second. But did you have any practical involvement in any aspect of this contract?
Not to my recollection, no.
Right. Now, if we go to page 8, we can see the objectives of the work are set out on that page there. Page 8. That's a list of deliverables. In fact, I think I'm showing you the closing report, which is not what I need to show you. I need to show you the proposal. Forgive me. BRE 401953. Yes, and if we go to page 8 there, which we now have, under project objectives, you can see what the objectives are. And specifically, the first is to conduct a forward look exercise, yes? And the second is to collate all the responses into a report.
Yes.
That's under task 1, and there's task 2, which has 2 parts to it: an analysis of the relevant fire safety aspects of local acts in England and Wales, and then recommendations at the bottom on possible provisions that may need to be placed within a revised approved document B, and those that could be repealed with a minimal impact. And if we look at page 9, you can see that the task there involved, if you look at task 3, you can see that involved, among other things, do you see it says the provisional of technical support to officials in the drafting, issue for consultation of responses, and further drafting of the new ADB, including associated diagrams, other documents that require drafting a draft regulatory impact assessment, RIA, to accompany the ADB consultation, and a full RIA together with a small business litmus test to accompany the revised AD. In addition, the support would include the provision of technical secretariat to cover all the various Part B working party meetings, including the preparation of the technical papers and minutes of meetings required to facilitate the effective revision of ADB. And if we go to page 21, we can see that there's a table on that page. And looking at that, you can see that B. Martin is the team member with responsibility as project manager, and Sarah Colwell at line 8 is the technical expert, yes?
Yes, yes.
And down to page 23, look at the resource table for year 2, task 3. You see that?
Yes.
Task 3A, 3C. Task 3A is the task we've just looked at. We see Brian Martin and Sarah Colwell listed there.
Yes.
Yes. Did you still not have direct oversight of Sarah Colwell's work at this time? Sarah Colwell says you did.
I was more than likely her line manager. Sorry, not
Right.
project manager.
Line manager.
Yes.
Yes. Now, quite a number of BRE employees were involved in this project. Were you kept up to speed with what was happening on it? And in particular, in relation to potential changes to ADB?
Not on a, regular basis, no.
But on an irregular basis, presumably?
I wasn't involved in the work whilst it was ongoing. I would have only looked at it when it came to me at the end of the project. I mean, Peter Field was very much overseeing this work.
Now, we'll come back to the Edge... we'll come back to ADB in a moment, but I want to ask you about the Edge fire in Manchester on the 6th of January 2005. Do you remember that fire? Do you know anything about that fire?
No, I don't.
Let me just tell you about it. It was a fire on the external face of a partially occupied block of flats known as the Edge in Salford in Manchester on the 6th of January 2005. Now, that therefore was during the period of the operation of the contract to support the department in relation to the revisions to ADB, wasn't it, as a matter of chronology?
It sounds like it, yes.
When was the first time you became aware of that fire?
I wasn't specifically aware of it at all.
Not at all?
No.
I mean, I've just mentioned it, but...
Yes, of course, yes.
But is now the first time you've heard of it?
I think I've heard of it since the Grenfell Tower fire.
Okay.
It's been mentioned.
Now, the inquiry has heard evidence that an investigation into that fire was carried out by the fire investigation team for the investigation of real fires under that contract between the BRE and government. Did you know that at the time?
No, I don't recall that.
The fire was in fact the subject of an investigation report written by Sam Greenwood and Sarah Colwell, dated 18th of January 2005. Let me show that to you to see if it's familiar. BRE 3035368. And there it is, fires of special interest. There's the date of the fire at the top, 6th January 2005, and there's the address, and there are the fire investigators, Sam Greenwood and Sarah Colwell. Report completed 18th January 2005. And then there's some details of the fire at the bottom of the page there. Is that a familiar document to you?
No.
And who is Sam Greenwood? Or who was he?
Sam Greenwood, I think, worked for Brian directly. I think he was recruited and worked directly for Brian.
And what was his role?
I don't know what his full job description was, but I mean, he was there to support Brian in all of the activities that he was undertaking.
Right. Now, there's a second report, which was a client report, dated the 31st of March 2005, and that is at CLG 3019455. Let's look at that and see if that's familiar to you. Prepared for Anthony Bird, 31st March 2005, looking at the second page there, page 2, prepared by Martin Shipp, Carol Rock, and Sam Greenwood, approved by Peter Field. Is that a document you've seen before, do you think?
I don't recall it, no.
Right, let's look at page 76 and we'll see the report on the Edge fire, and I can give you a quick summary of it. And the reason I'm doing this, notwithstanding your lack of familiarity with this document, is that this provides background to some questions I've got for you on the amendments. But you can see the details there, but I'm going to summarise. The building was a 19-storey building clad in sandwich panels made of an expanded polystyrene core with aluminium skins. The fire started in the balcony area of the second floor. The sandwich panels then delaminated and exposed the polystyrene core to the fire. And after that, the spread of the fire was, quotes, extremely fast, as it says. This fifth line up from the bottom of that long paragraph, spreading up 17 floors in less than 10 minutes. And also, unusual downward fire spread had occurred. Now, I've summarised that. At the end of the paragraph, on that same page, it says, it was not possible to establish if the cladding system had been installed complete with cavity barriers at floor level in accordance with approved document B, but fire and rescue service sources believe that this was the case. However, the fact that the fire burned so readily through the core of this type of sandwich panel means that even if the construction complied with current guidance, the rapid fire spread through the panels themselves would not be restricted. As such, the fire and rescue services have grave concerns that when the building becomes fully occupied, a fire of this nature could quickly become out of control and put the lives of occupants at risk. Now, were you aware, even generally, of the Fire and Rescue Service's concerns, grave concerns at this time?
No, I was not.
Then let's look at Peter Field's quarterly report to the department from April 2006. This is at BRE 30010078. One 0078. This is the report prepared on the 20th of April 2006 for the ADPM, and if we go to page 2, we can see that it was written by Peter Field for Sylvia Burns and approved by Peter Field, curiously. And if you go please to page 5 and the second bullet under the heading, the Edge Development, you can see that there in the middle of the page. Starting at the second paragraph of that section, it says, the sandwich panels were fixed to the building, leaving a cavity barrier between the panels and the structural walls. It was evident that there was no attempt to provide barriers within the core of the panels, and as such, fire spread through the panels themselves was not restricted. Current guidance in ADB warns against the use of combustible materials, but more specific guidance refers only to insulation, underlined, used in ventilated cavities. In the case of this building, however, the polystyrene core was not primarily used for its insulating properties, but as a low-cost filler to provide stiffness to the decorative aluminium cladding. It is conceivable that the designers may have taken the view that this restriction was not applicable. It has been suggested to ADPM that they revisit the current guidance and consider if less prescriptive guidance could be given to avoid any confusion in the future. Now, just focusing on that final sentence there, were you yourself aware at the time that that suggestion had been made to the department by the BRE?
Not that I can recall, no.
Were you completely unaware?
As far as I can recall, I was not aware of this.
And just leaving aside the issue of fire barriers within the core of a panel and how that might work, do you agree, looking at it now, that this paragraph identifies a fundamental problem with the guidance on external fire spread in what was then the 2002 edition of Approved Document B?
It's flagging up that there could be a potential issue, yes.
Yes, and that issue, just agree with me on this, was that the restriction on the combustibility of insulation under what was, I think, paragraph 13.7, applied only to insulation and didn't apply to all significant elements of the external wall build-up over 18 metres, including external facings.
That's my reading of that, yes.
Yeah. And I think, is this right? You were well aware, I think, that at least by 2005, that BS 476 tests for class 0 were particularly unsuitable, as you've told us, as a means of assessing or controlling fire hazard in the case of composite products.
Yes, and yes, yeah.
And in part that's because although the surface of a composite product might be class 0, thus allowing the product as a whole to be class 0, the core could be highly combustible.
Yes, correct.
Do you, well, perhaps you don't, but what does giving less prescriptive guidance mean in this context? I mean, how would less prescriptive guidance work?
Yeah, I don't know.
Right. Now, we don't need to go to it, but Anthony Bird in his witness statement tells us, and it's paragraph 31 on page 13, that it was in response to this advice, this report, which he says was given to him by Brian Martin, that the amendments were made to what became 12.7 in the 2006-7 edition of Approved Document B, and what gave rise to the words, or the introduction of the words, filler, material, etc., within 12.7. Were you aware of that at the time?
No, I wasn't.
Were you at all involved in the discussions or the advice given to Anthony Bird by Brian Martin?
No, I wasn't.
As far as you're aware, was any specific consideration given at this time to use this opportunity to raise concerns within the department about the continued reliance on Class 0 and therefore small-scale testing within Diagram 40?
Not that I can recall, no.
Let's then turn to the text of the 2006 edition of Approved Document B. We find that at CLG 1607. There's the first page, 2006 edition. And if we go to page 96, please, we can see paragraph 12.7. And let's look at the title first, and then we'll look at the text. The title says, Insulation Materials / Products. And the text says this: in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler, material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility, see Appendix A. This restriction does not apply to masonry cavity wall construction, which complies with diagram 34 in section 9. Now, can we take it that you are familiar with that paragraph?
Yes, I am.
Can we take it that you were familiar with it upon its entry into the 2006 edition?
I would have been at some point after the publication of the 2006 edition.
When do you think you first read that paragraph which contained the words filler material, ... etc.?
Yeah, I don't recall. I don't recall when that would have been.
Can we agree that the previous wording, the wording of the equivalent provision in the approved document B that this replaced, applied to insulation material used in ventilated cavities in the external wall construction?
That's my understanding, yes.
And you say you first became aware of the inclusion of these amendments to paragraph 12.7 sometime after 2007, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Right. When you... So were you aware of... I mean, presumably you weren't aware of this change before it was introduced?
No, I wasn't.
When you did become aware of it, how did you become aware of it?
I mean, I do recall discussion around what this actually meant, and it was explained, and I took that at face value, that the filler material covered by this was intended to be the material that is placed between within the sandwich panels or whatever, that is not there for the purpose of insulation.
Right. Now, let's just break that answer up, if we can, please. You say you do recall discussion around what this actually meant. First of all, when was that discussion?
Yeah, I don't. That's what I don't recall. Is exactly. It would have been around the time that I first became aware of this.
Right.
And I don't remember when that was.
Who did you have that discussion with?
It would have been predominantly Sarah.
And who else?
Depending on when it was, it might have involved Brian, but more likely Sarah.
And you say it was explained. Who gave you the explanation that you've just referred to?
Well, it would have been Sarah.
Do you recall a conversation in which Sarah Colwell told you that the filler material covered by this was intended to be the core of an external panel?
Yes, I do.
You do. Do you recall any wider conversation about the general import, the whole purpose of 12.7?
No, I'm not sure I understand really what you're asking.
Was the conversation specifically directed to the core of an external panel, rain screen panel, or did she tell you that in fact the purpose of adding the word filler there was to provide that all products or materials in the external wall makeup, including external facings, were to be materials of limited combustibility?
No, this was within the context, I think, of filler.
Right. How did the context arise? What gave rise to the discussion?
Clarification on what the intended meaning of this was.
Did you seek clarification from her, or did she come to you and give it to you?
I don't recall which way round that would have been.
Right. Can you remember what the trigger for that was?
I don't. No, I don't remember.
Was it you first reading it and asking, what does that mean, and then going to her, or was it a client?
No, it wouldn't have been a client.
Right.
I wasn't involved in client discussions.
Was there any discussion that you were involved in about what impact that interpretation of the word filler within 12.7 had on the provisions of paragraph 12.6 and diagram 40?
Again, I'm not quite sure I fully understand what you're asking.
Well, when discussing 12.7 and the purpose of the inclusion of the words filler material, etc., was there also a discussion about what knock-on effect that might have, if any, on diagram 40, which remained unamended?
I don't recall one specifically.
Now, Sarah Colwell tells us in her witness statement, let's show it to you, BRE 3047571, page 56, paragraph 359. Thank you. And I think I need the whole of the page, please, if we can have the whole of the page, because there is a series of questions. And it's question G, and this is addressed to Sarah Colwell. Did you ever discuss any of the matters contained within paragraph 12.7 or the inclusion of that paragraph in approved document B with any of the following? And then your name is at D at the foot of the page. She says this: as part of general conversation within the fire safety group at BRE, I would have had discussions with Debbie Smith and other colleagues related to the proposed changes to approved document B. However, I have no recollections of specific discussions. Do you recall any discussions with her about the proposed changes? In
No.
other words, those pre-publication?
Yeah, no, I don't.
You don't. Can you say she's wrong about that? Or do you just not recall one way or the other?
I don't recall any. I don't recall particularly looking at that clause until after the document was published.
Right.
And I don't think we would have seen the pre-consultation document.
When you did first read 12.7, did you have any understanding of what it meant or what it was meant to mean? Or did you simply rely on Sarah Colwell to tell you? Did you have your own independent thoughts about it?
I mean, it would depend how it cropped up. I really don't recall. I don't recall whether I asked because I wasn't clear or whether it was just, as Sarah's suggesting, you know, maybe volunteered information in a broader context. But
Right.
I don't recall.
I mean, what was your own view about the scope and meaning of the new paragraph or the new words in the paragraph?
In terms of the filler specifically.
Yes.
Well, as I've already said, I think, I mean, my understanding was, and the way it was conveyed, was that it was the material that basically sat between like two sandwich panels or two metal outer layers. So actually it would also capture what we now know as ACM.
Let me see if I can get at this slightly differently. Was your understanding of the meaning and purpose of the words filler, etc., material, etc., derived from the language alone of paragraph 12.7 and its heading set in its context, or was it derived from what Sarah Colwell told you?
It was derived from the discussions that took place.
So not your exercise of reading and understanding, but what you were told?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes, I see. Did you, once you were told by Sarah Colwell what it was intended to mean or do, did you consider that the wording of 12.7 was clear and unambiguous?
I don't think I would have had a particular view on that. insofar as the whole wording and the document and so on would be discussed by the working party and then the full BRAC, and you would expect that others who have a much greater knowledge of construction products in general, in terms of like cladding and so on, would know what the terminology and the correct terminology that would be understood out there in the wider world was and would be appropriate to use. And that's where I would have imagined that terminology would have come from.
Well, in that answer, you've used expressions like, I don't think I would have, and you would have imagined. What I would like to understand is, did you have an understanding of your own about what filler meant?
No, I wouldn't have done.
Did you think at the time that it was clear what it meant?
Only when it was explained.
Only when it was explained. Did you think at the time that there was a particular industry understanding of the word filler, so that although you weren't an expert in cladding or matters of that nature, it was crystal clear to the participants in the cladding industry what it meant?
Well, I wouldn't have had a direct view of that at the time, but I say the background to that would have been that, that there would have been consultation that would have gone on around this, and people would have defined it in a means that was clear and crystal, even if it wasn't to me as a non-expert in the cladding sector.
Do you know why the word filler, or the phrase filler material, etc., was not defined?
No, I don't.
What did etc. mean?
I don't know.
Did you ask?
I don't recall asking, no.
Did it not strike you as a peculiarly vague little abbreviation or Latinism?
No, not particularly.
What did you think that cladding subcontractors, picking up approved document B, as no doubt they routinely did, would take from the word etc.?
I don't think I would have given it that degree of forensic examination. So I don't have any recollection of thinking about that at the time.
Did you ask Sarah Colwell, what does etc. mean?
I have no recollection of that, no.
Did you ever have a discussion with Brian Martin about this phrase, or the constituent elements of this phrase?
Not that I can recollect, no.
Right. Were you aware that in March 2016, many years later, 10 years later to be precise, Brian Martin told members of the CWC2 fire group that he accepted that this wording was, quotes, poorly written, quotes, open to interpretation, and, quotes, misleading?
No, I wouldn't have known that at the time.
And you wouldn't ever have thought that of this provision yourself?
I was not working with that on a daily basis, so I would have had little reason to revisit it.
Do you know why this term appeared under the heading insulation materials / products if it was intended to apply to materials which were not insulation?
No, I don't.
Did you ever ask that question?
I don't recall.
Why not?
What? Why don't I recall?
No, not why don't you recall. Can you give us a reason why you never asked?
Well, I don't recall if I asked or not.
Right. I see. After the publication of the 2006 edition of the approved document, did you become aware at any point before the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017 of any question or debate within any part of industry about the meaning of the word filler, material, etc., or the scope of that amendment to paragraph 12.7 of approved document B?
Not that I can recall.
When was the first time? Did you ever become aware of that, the existence of such a debate before the Grenfell Tower fire?
I say not that I can recall. Obviously, after the Grenfell Tower fire, then that's when all of these discussions came to the fore and became apparent in the media and various other fora. At the time, it was my absolute view that the wording in not just paragraph 12.7 but in 12.5 to 12.9 was clear, and I had no reason to doubt that, because nobody had raised particular issues with me personally to say that it wasn't clear.
Clear in saying what, Dr. Smith?
In terms of the provisions that it laid out.
No, what did it clearly say? What you say it was clear?
Yeah, it said that,
Clearly what? Clearly saying what?
that basically the external wall makeup should be made of components that are of limited combustibility, or you need to comply with the requirements laid out in 12.5 to 12.9, I think it is, or 12. I can't remember the clause.
Well, no,
numbers without-
with great respect, that
Yeah.
what you've just said doesn't work at all. I'm sorry. That doesn't work, because insulation had to be materials of limited combustibility unless it was going to go through an 8414 test.
Yes.
Yes. So what you've just said just isn't right. So let's just take it in stages. Clear in what respect? What was 12.6 to 12.9 clearly telling the building owner?
Yeah,
Developer?
so if you didn't have materials within the system that were all of limited combustibility, then you followed the guidance as in 12.6 to 12.9, I think it is, isn't it?
Well, that's not right, is it? 12.6 says you have to, is the linear route for external
Can we call it up
services.
and then I can talk
Yes, of course.
specifically
Let's
about
do
the
that.
clauses rather than trying to do this from memory?
I'm sorry, it may be my fault for assuming too much, but let's look at it, which is at CLG 1607.
Sorry, can I have the reference again, please?
It's CLG 1607. And let's go to page 95. Let's see if we can work this through together. CLG 1607. Now the heading is Construction of External Walls. Let's pick it up on the right-hand side in the column towards the bottom of the page, External Wall Construction. 12.5, the external envelope of a building
Yes.
should not provide a medium for fire spread if it is likely to be a risk to health or safety. The use of combustible materials in the cladding and extensive cavities may present such a risk in tall buildings. External walls should either meet the guidance given in 12.6 to 12.9 or meet the performance criteria given in BRE 135 for shorthand.
Yes.
No, I don't think we need the rest. And then you have 12.6 to 12.9. 12.6, external surfaces. The external surfaces of walls should meet, turn the page please, the provisions in diagram 40. Let's quickly turn to diagram 40, which is on page 97. Yes, and there it is, class 0 or B S3D2 or better, and we've seen that already.
Yes.
Yes. Back a page, please, to 96. So that's what you have to do for external walls. Insulation materials products, 12.7. In a building with a story 80 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction, should be of limited combustibility. See Appendix A. 12 there's the restriction exception for masonry cavity walls, cavity barriers 12.8, and something in 12.9 which we really don't need to get into at all.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, you can see how the scheme here, can't you? It's linear routes under 12.6 in diagram 40 for the external walls. 12.7 is insulation, including filler, whatever that means. Or alternatively, you can go the 8414 BR135 route, yes?
Yes.
Right. And the only reference there to the requirement for materials of limited combustibility is in 12.7, isn't it?
Yes.
Not in 12.6?
Yes.
Yes. Unless the basis, to be fair to you, unless the basis for your Class 0 achievement for your external panel happens to be that it's composed throughout of a material of limited combustibility.
Yes.
Because that's what paragraph 13A of Appendix A says. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, what is the clear message from everything I've just shown you? What did you think that was clearly telling the reader?
It was providing them with two options, two routes for demonstrating compliance.
And leaving aside the alternative route, 8414 and 135, the first route is which I think many people have called the linear route. Yes?
Yeah, I don't know.
You've never heard
what
that
you're calling
expression?
it. No.
Right. But if you're not following the 8414 route, then 12.6 in diagram 40 told you what you had to do for the external wall, yes?
Yes.
And 12.7 told you what you had to do for insulation materials, stroke products, as required in the text.
Yes.
Now, look, putting those two together, what was your understanding about what those two paragraphs were clearly telling the reader, Dr. Smith?
Well, based on the my understanding of the term filler material, I mean, and this is where obviously the confusion arises and has arisen, and that's now self-evident since the Grenfell Tower fire, that that too, within a sandwich panel, should be of limited combustibility. But clearly that is not the way that people had interpreted that guidance.
Now, if that's the case, if that is how you understood it, you say it was clear to you, can you explain why you didn't give any thought to what that would mean for diagram 40, 12.6 and diagram 40? How would the two sit together?
Well, diagram 40 is about the external surface, so you could still have a sandwich panel, for example, as a rain screen element that had a limited combustibility filler in it, but had a combustible coating, such as we spoke earlier about plastisol in the context of the steel sheets and the radar project.
How would Class 0 work then, as was one of the two options, as we've seen in diagram 40?
That was restricting the extent to which the surface coating that you would put onto, say, a sandwich panel can spread the fire, can spread the flames. So Class 0 is putting a constraint on that, as opposed to saying, well, it can be Class 1 or Class 3, in which case, you could permit a greater extent, of fire spread, flame spread on the surface.
I see. And that's how you, at the time, did you actually at the time reconcile your reading of 12.7 and the reference to Class 0 in diagram 40 in that way?
That was my understanding.
And who gave you
Yes.
that understanding?
In terms of diagram 40 or overall? I mean, as I said, the issue of filler was discussed with colleagues, but that was my understanding in relation to diagram 40.
Right. So was your understanding that the surface had to be of limited combustibility or not?
The surface?
The surface of the external wall above 18 metres, did that have to be of limited combustibility?
No, not according to diagram 40.
Right. So therefore, was your understanding that not all elements of the external wall build-up had to be of limited combustibility?
Not if you followed this alternative route, no.
So I thought you said earlier that you did, that all significant elements your way of understanding, after the introduction of the word filler, of the external wall build-up had to be made of materials of limited combustibility. Is that not right?
No, this is the understanding
You say this is the understanding.
that we've just discussed now. That was my
So
understanding.
let me be clear, your understanding,
Yes.
is this right, was that by the introduction of the word filler, only the core of a composite panel had to be a material of limited combustibility, but not the surface.
Correct.
And that understanding, where was that derived from?
Diagram 40.
Mr. Chairman, we may need to revisit that. We will need to revisit that and continue this very fascinating debate tomorrow morning.
But if we're coming back to it, I will not ask a question that had occurred to me.
Well, I think we are going to come back to it, but
All right. No, that's all right. I
We'll do
just exercise a degree of patience.
yes, I'm some way from the end of this topic, so this is certainly a good place to break.
Well, we've reached the end of the afternoon, and I'm sure it's gone on long enough for you as well as for others. So we'll break there for the day. I'm sorry I've got to ask you to come back for some more questions tomorrow. I hope you've been warned that was the
Yes.
case.
Yes,
All
it
right,
is.
good. So we'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're away from the room.
Okay.
All right?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would you go to the usher, please? Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.